حي على الفلاح. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah. I mentioned yesterday about the science of tasawwuf has two aspects. One is conformity. It's really fiqh al-batin. Just like you have fiqh al-zahir, like you have the fiqh of doing wudu, then you have fiqh al-batin which relates to the niyyah, the ikhlas, the khushu' in the prayer, that you're actually present in the prayer. So it relates to those elements of the religion that are not external. Because you have Islam, which is the external, and then you have Iman, which is the vertical component of the external. Because Iman and Islam go together. In religious tradition, you talk about vertical and horizontal traditions. So the horizontal is the Islam. It's how you relate to other people and what you do outwardly. Islam is an outward phenomenon. Although Islam covers Iman and Ihsan, it has that general meaning. But it's also an outward phenomenon. So, like in the Quran when it says, قَالَتَ الْعَرَابُ آمَنَّا, the desert Arabs, they say, we believe. And Allah says, don't say we believe. وَلَمَّا يَدْخُلِ الْإِيمَانُ فِي قُلُوبِكُمْ لَا تَقُولُوا آمَنَّا وَلَكِنْ قُولُوا أَسْلَمْنَا. Don't say we believe, but say we are in a state of Islam. So we're Muslims. Don't say we're mu'minun. And there's a khilaf about making that claim, and the Ash'aris and the Maturidis have a khilaf about that. Because the Ash'aris say, you say ana mu'min jazman. And the Maturidis say, no, you say ana mu'minun insha'Allah. And the difference is the Ash'aris believe that shaqawa and sa'ada are permanent states. Whereas the Maturidi believe they're not. They're actual individual states. So you can be a mu'min at one time and become a kafir at another time. And that's a difference. And that's why, according to the one madhab, you can't make takfir of anybody in that way, because you don't know what their state is with God. So if you see a person who's not a Muslim, he might be a mu'min 'inda Allah. So you shouldn't make the false assumption that it's a kafir. And that's why if you look at the Sahaba, when they talked, they don't call people kafir. They say, Ya adu Allah, O enemy of God, or Ya adu wa nafsika. They would say things like that. They wouldn't say, Ya kafir. Because, Allahu alam, they might become Muslim. Like Abu Sufyan, when he was fighting the Prophet, the reality, he was a mu'min. He didn't know it yet, but Allah knew it. So that's a type of difference of opinion about people's states. The akhlaq, or trying to conform outwardly, and then you have the inward, the iman, which is the vertical. That's what connects you to Allah. So the Islam becomes meaningful in its celestial dimension. Because a munafiq can practice Islam. So outwardly you can see all the things of a munafiq and you think they're Muslim, but there's no vertical connection. It's a horizontal phenomenon. And the iman introduces the vertical connection. And then the ihsan is the depth of it. It brings in the third dimension of depth. So it brings depth to that vertical connection. Because the iman is moving towards completion. So you can have Iman as a continuum. And this again is a khilaf. Abu Hanifa said Iman doesn't increase or decrease. And that when it says that in the Quran, زَادَتْهُمْ إِيمَانًا, it doesn't mean like they got more Iman. They just got more things to believe in. But he considered Iman to be one thing. And you either had it or you didn't. And so the increase in Iman is not really an increase in the phenomenon of belief. It's just an increase in what you believe in. So the more you believe in, the more you have Iman in. Like once somebody teaches you to believe that the Prophet ﷺ is the best of creation. So you believe that. If you didn't know that before, you've increased your dimension of Iman. But the reality of Iman is the same. That's Abu Hanifa's position. The other position, which is the dominant position, is that Iman increases. وَرُجِّحَتْ زِيَادَةُ الْإِيمَانِ بِمَا تَزِيدُ طَاعَةُ الْإِنسَانِ. That the preferred opinion is the increase of Iman based upon increase in obedience. So the more obedience, the bigger the Iman. So if you put the Iman of Abu Bakr in one kufa, like the Prophet said, and the Iman of the rest of the Ummah, with the exception of his Iman, Abu Bakr's Iman would outweigh the entire Ummah. So the Iman of a person differs. So increasing Iman, that's what ihsan is about. Increasing the dimension of Iman. The Iman is the vertical connection, but now you're increasing the actual space of Iman. It's becoming bigger. It's taking on more depth. And that's really what this science is about. It's about increasing, the Quran talks about sharh al-sadr, sharahna sadrak. We expanded your breast. That expansion is to enable the Iman to have room. So the more you grow, the more expansion, spiritual expansion in your heart that you get. And so that aspect is, so you have the conformity, which is the outward aspect of tasawwuf. Good character, adab with people, humility, all those type of things. But then you have, and that's what they call akhlaq. That's akhlaq. So really, tasawwuf, part of it is the science of ethics. It's what in the West they call ethics. How to be a virtuous human being. And then you have another aspect which is called adwaq, which is the actual tasting of spiritual states. So, for instance, we know many examples of the Sahaba where, for instance, the man who was shot with an arrow while he was standing in prayer and didn't feel it. We have many confirmed reports like that. I'll just give you an example. There's been studies with Tibetan lamas. And I actually read one study, and I met a man who was actually one of the monks that did this study, the Dalai Lama's students. But in physiology, you have what's called a startle factor. Like if you hear a loud noise, you get a reaction, central nervous system, and you can't stop that reaction. So, people do that. You can't. If you get startled, people have different degrees. Some people really get scared. Other people, it's just, but they always notice certain things. Well, what they would do with these monks, when they would go into their deep meditation, they fired guns near them. They didn't notice. There was only a slight startle factor. And when they would come out of their meditation, they would ask them, "Did you hear anything?" And they would say, "I heard a very faint sound from a distance." So these types of aspects are not limited to Islam. You can have, in Hinduism, you have yogis that do certain practices and get into certain states. These are not limited to the Muslims. So there's actually scientific evidence for these types of phenomena. But what's interesting about this, and this is why I mentioned this last night, the reason it's considered a science is because there are states and stations that are replicable. If you repeat the processes, you will get the same results with sincerity, with niyyah. So in that way, there's an element to it which is experimental science. But obviously, there has to be belief in it.